All right, welcome everybody to the Transformative versus Derivative, an exploration of fan fiction in the age of franchise. This is a panel that combines a lot of previous topics I've talked about during my various time doing panels at conventions. This is a very special panel I've been wanting to do for a while now. I'm doing this at PonyFest, the fourth PonyFest. And surprisingly, it's not a panel about ponies much. So if you guys are not turned off by the fact that there might not be as much ponies as you are used to, well, welcome, and I hope you guys enjoy the next hour of our conversation. All right, so let's get started. Again, this is transformative versus derivative. Now, if you were coming for me for another type of transformation art, this is not the panel. I do have some videos on transformation on my YouTube channel, which I should have linked in the chat. And I'm also vending at this convention. So if you guys are interested in checking out some of my special PonyFest online merch, I have pre-orders for pins, I have masks, I have flags. If you guys are interested, feel free to check that out. All right, let's begin. A little background about myself. You guys might know me in the fandom as ChocoPony or Transformative. I've been doing panels in the fandom now for about 10 years. And I've also been involved with many other conventions and many other projects. You guys might know me from my convention history project, in which I was researching the history of conventions for the last few years. This goes along with my panels I normally do on the topic of art and history. So this panel kind of combines a lot of my interests together. If you guys are interested in following me, check out my social media, which is posted below. And all right, let's begin. So a little bit about my background. You guys might know me as an artist. I'm a writer. I've written a few history books on the topic of narrative art and other niche topics. I also studied genetic biology at Johns Hopkins University, which kind of informed how I look at things, specifically my unique perspective on the evolution of art. I kind of see as one would see an evolutionary tree. You guys might notice this from my previous panels I've done, especially my panel on the history of conventions, where if you look at the diagram here, I kind of laid it out as if it was an evolutionary organism. And one of the topics I do cover a lot in my panels, whether I'm at a Comic-Con or not, I always always go back to Watchmen, Alan Moore, as what I like to use as an example of what I call transformative art. It's a term I'm going to describe a little bit more in detail, but it's something that I've been a part of. I've been trying to talk about more. I want to get people more interested, especially if there are writers and artists out there who kind of want to expand their work more than just from the realm of fan fiction and try to get into more professional work. This is one of the topics I like talking about, and more so, I think this is really I do these panels because it's more a way to kind of motivate my own self to try to start making art and stories and comics in the realm that I like doing. So recently, I actually made a Twitter thread on some of these topics, and I actually looked at the definitions of transformative art and derivative art, and in the context of Watchmen and its franchises, which you guys could see on my Twitter page. And I'm going to go back to this because this is what kind of sparked the interest in the direction I'm going on for this one. So Watchmen, I would say, is a good example of a work that we can use to gauge how works that have been inspired from it are either considered transformative or derivative. Watchmen itself was inspired by the Charlton comics. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons took characters from Charlton comics and made their own analogs to kind of create their own work. And then from them, because Watchmen has been the best-selling graphic novel in the English world for the last 3 decades, has seen its own forms of derivatives and stuff. So, for example, within the last year, in the last decade, we've seen many different adaptations and takes on Watchmen, from the Zack Snyder film to the acclaimed HBO TV show, and of course the comic series Doomsday Clock. You guys might know that the creator of Watchmen, Alan Moore, is a little bit upset with how he's seeing his property handled, and that gets into a little bit of that gets into some issues people might have with Alan Moore, because wouldn't Moore be considered a hypocrite, considering a lot of Moore's work? In fact, some of his best works were all derivatives or his own quote unquote fan fiction of works that came before. Lost Girls, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and Watchmen, of course, are examples of Moore taking characters that were created by other authors and writers, and he did their own take on them. And of course, in the last decade, Moore got a little bit of heat for when he deconstructed J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter in the third volume of his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen series. So how can Moore have a ground to stand on that he's upset with the adaptation of Watchmen when he himself has been doing this to other creators in the past? So let's first talk about the important definition of how we could define art. The fact that Alan Moore's definition of art has really informed and inspired my definition, I think it's important to lay this out. But when we think of art in the modern day, when we think of narrative art, art meant for storytelling, we normally think of that as synonymous with entertainment. We think of the narrative fictions, comics, novels, television shows, movies as just forms of entertainment. And we normally see this type of art as escapist. On the other hand, there are a lot of writers who see art as a political message. It's a way to get information out there. It's a way to kind of shape how culture and civilizations think. And you see throughout time, most authors kind of fall into one category or the other. I used to call this escapism, escapist art, in terms of art being entertainment, versus transformative art in terms of art being subversive political messages. One of the most famous example of this debate, or at least the two sides of this, is with Michael Moorcock's essay, The Epic Pooh, which really was used to kind of highlight the split in speculative fiction into epic fantasy or high fantasy and hardcore science fiction, especially with Michael Moorcock's new wave science fiction. Now, for most of the early days of science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction were seen as kind of the same umbrella of genre. It was when J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and then later his Lord of the Rings series that we started to see fantasy take a more, you could say, high escapist epic route. This is where we get sword and sorcery and the adventures style fantasy stories. Michael Moorcock really was not really fond of this, and he didn't like the escapist nature of science fiction in America. If you think about the science fiction golden age in America, it could be basically summarized as cowboys in space. It was glorifying the future of mankind, or as Alan Moore put it best, while older countries like Britain can go back to their past with their own historic myths like King Arthur and the course of Britain, America as a young country, we didn't have such a rich mythology to draw into. So the American mythology was really what we had during the golden age of science fiction, like you were saying, cowboys in space. Now, Michael Moorcock, is a writer who inspired Alan Moore. They are actually very good friends. Moorcock's idea was we shouldn't be seeing the future as, glorious and, seafaring folks conquering the stars. The fact that we are dealing in a world with civil rights issues, with racism, with classism, with poverty, if we can't fix and change our current situation, then the future will probably not be as bright and glorious. And Michael Moorcock's new wave science fiction inspired a new wave of dystopian inspired science fiction novels and science fiction stories. So this is where we get more dark, subversive stories. And I used to use this as a gauge between escapism and transformation, um, especially when I use it to compare the different derivatives of Watchmen. When in reality, I think that might be summarizing a bit too much. So I actually came up with my own chart where I actually put transformative works and derivative works on the ends of the spectrums from each other, and escapist art and subversive art on the other ends of the spectrum from each other. Now, this works perfectly because I would say both Alan Moore and another British comic book writer, Grant Morrison, they both write transformative works, but Alan Moore's works are seen as more subversive, while Grant Morrison's are seen as more escapist. And normally, escapist works are fall more in a derivative category, but it doesn't mean all escapist work must be derivative. Some could be transformative, like Lauren Faust's reboot of My Little Pony, for example. And normally, more subversive works would fall under the transformative category. But of course, that's not always the case. We see a lot of gory torture porn horror movies, which you could say are subversive, but they aren't really that transformative when you look at it. And of course, it doesn't mean that all derivative works, which normally are escapists, are escapists. Last Jedi, for example, you could, whether you liked it or not, you could say was subversive to the Star Wars franchise itself. So all these works really could fall somewhere in this scale, in this chart, where you could see as a form of subversive versus escapist, or transformative versus derivative. Now, this goes into what we're talking about, our history of fan fiction. Now, we kind of think of fan fiction as a more modern concept. That's because the things that we identify with classifying fan fiction, like copyright laws, franchise culture, media fandoms, are all modern concept, but we could really think of the idea of fan fiction as old as storytelling itself. Um, Both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, they are not just comic book writers, they are practicing magicians and believe in a literal concept of magic. They draw their inspiration from what they see as a shamanic tradition. In fact, depending on which group of people you talk to, most people would say it's the shamans that were kind of responsible for the start of human civilization, or at least help give birth to what we now like to think of human civilization. Like Alan Moore would like to claim, every single culture around the world, whether it's the Inuits or Africans or Chinese or Mayans, had their own forms of shamans. And the shamans during this time were not only the viziers to the leaders, the tribal leaders and chiefs, they were also the religious leaders, they were the doctors, they were the scientists, and most importantly, they were the storytellers. They would impart stories that summarize important morals and lessons that they felt needed to be preserved and passed down to the next generation. And they will share these stories to the next generation of shamans, and these shamans will tell those stories to the next generation of shamans. Of course, over time, these shamans would kind of put their own take on these. So you could kind of think about each shaman retelling the stories with their own headcanon, and thus creating a new version of that story. Essentially, you could kind of see, with the birth of storytelling comes the birth of fan fiction. Because if you want to think about it, each time a storyteller imparts their own headcanon or their own take on a story, it becomes a new element in and of itself. These shamans were also the first to really create art, or what we like to think of as art. For example, we like to look at a lot of these old cave paintings. A lot of these cave paintings, a lot of people would say, have connections with the magical or spiritual realm. We could see this as the art actually not just being some of the first early art, but also our first language. So if we look at this painting of a cow on the cave, this is not just a painting of a cow. This is also our first word for cow. So you could kind of see how over time, both our language and art evolved from these simplistic paintings on caves. you could see this in Egyptian hieroglyphics and even within the Chinese language, where you could still see it had a pictographic history. But over time, we like to see art become more and more representational and language becoming more and more abstract, which is why it makes sense that both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, who are comic book writers, would love or see themselves as part of this Shamantic tradition, since comics are one of the few mediums that reunite the written word and the picture back together again. So I keep on saying that both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison believe in magic, and while I think it's important to give a definition for why they see art as magic, because it helps us understand Alan Moore's perspective and his definition for the type of stories he is writing. Now, both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison could easily summarize magic as just a transformative source. So we like to think of magic nowadays as hocus pocus, poof, I turn into a frog type stuff. Alan Moore would argue, if we think of what magic is in its simplistic definition, it's a manipulation of words and a manipulation of symbols to achieve a transformation within the world. So in that sense, writing is a type of magic, because writing is just manipulating words together to have an effect upon the viewer. In fact, Alan Moore would argue that both the term spell, as in casting a spell, and spelling, when we come to writing, have the same roots. He also would say that both the term for the book of magic, grimoire, and grammar also have the same roots. In fact, Alan Moore would even say that a bard is a more powerful magician than a witch, because while a witch might curse someone to turn into a toad, a bard can write a satire about someone so witty that that person would be humiliated for generations and generations to come. So both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, yes, they believe in magic, but in their definition, our definition of art is magic. And that would actually make sense, because if you look at the term for magic in almost every culture, magic is always referred to as the art or the arts. So kind of makes sense in this way. So going with the idea of shamans telling stories from one generation to another, the idea of, like I said, fan fiction has always been with us with storytelling. In fact, if we think of our Greek myths, for example, a lot of people like Virgil were essentially writing fan fiction of the works of Homer and a lot of the old Greek storytelling. In fact, I grew up loving Greek myths. I know all the different variations of them, and I would be that nerd that will go and correct someone when it comes to getting a myth wrong. Yeah, I also love the Disney Hercules movies, and a lot of people will point out that Disney Hercules were inaccurate to the traditional myths. And I would argue technically no, because the Greek stories and Greek myths that we know of today were essentially telephone games of stories and fan fictions of these stories retold over time until they got to us in this modern day and age. So the fact that Disney was able to do its own riff on these Greek myths is part of this grand tradition. In fact, we could think of Jason and the Argonauts as one of the early, what we would call crossover fan fiction. Some of the first crossover fan fiction were taking these gods and heroes from these different separate myths and putting them together into its larger story. In fact, when we had our first novels, the Chinese were considered the first to invent the concept of the written novel. We basically saw fan fictions of these older myths done in these first novels. For example, Journey to the West was essentially a crossover fiction between the Taoist and the Buddhist gods. And when the novel was finally invented in the West, a lot of people consider Don Quixote the first Western novel. Within a year of Don Quixote being published, someone wrote an unauthorized sequel to Don Quixote. So you could see, as long as stories have existed, fan fiction has existed. Whenever stories find a new technology or medium to be told in, a new type of fan fiction would follow suit within very closely afterwards. So this idea of taking stories that came before him and riffing on it is something that Yale professor Harold Bloom also talked about, especially when it came to his interpretation of the evolution of English poetry. So in his book, Anxiety of Influence, he talked about how poets would kind of learn and try to copy the poets that came beforehand. And the poets who were strong and basically created their own new branch or new genre or new type style of poetry were ones who did strong misreadings of the predecessors. And weak poets were ones who simply repeated the ideas of the predecessors that came before. So basically, coming from my perspective as a genetic biologist, this is evolution. This is a mutation. When mutations happen in the DNA codon, if that mutation is successful, it will create an offspring that could survive and pass on that mutation to its next generation. If the mutation is not helpful, that creature is going to die off. What I see in biological evolution, Harold Bloom sees within the evolution of English poetry. Strong poets misinterpret what comes before, and the weak poets were ones who were simply repeating the ideas that came beforehand. So the idea of taking what you thought was your headcanon and making your own story out of it, very, very common. In fact, J.R.R. Tolkien, you could say, was essentially rewriting his own headcanons of Shakespeare with his Lord of the Ring trilogy. In fact, Shakespeare himself was, most of his famous works were retellings of pre-existing stories that came beforehand. Specifically within Lord of the Rings, of course, there's the, in Macbeth, there's a famous prophecy, no man born of woman can defeat Macbeth. And Tolkien really thought that should mean a woman should be able to beat Macbeth, but it was but in reality, it was someone who was born from a C-section. So, of course, he added that in his own stories for Lord of the Rings. Or he was, when he was a kid, he was actually upset that one of the other prophecies in the Shakespeare story about he pictured as like literal marching woods, literal marching trees coming upon the city to conquer. And in reality, when he saw that was just a metaphor, it's like, well, I'm going to have walking trees in my own story. So you could see that the idea of taking what came before, misinterpreting, can really inspire a lot of new stories. Now, as we head on to the modern day, a lot of people say that Edgar Allan Poe is kind of the father of modern literature. The fact that his stories, Murders at the Moulin Rouge, Edgar Allan Poe's story is considered the first modern detective story. A lot of his gothic horror stories inspire other horror writers that came after. And a lot of people say that his only novel, his first and only novel, Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, really helped inspire the growing field of science fiction. In fact, Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym and Edgar Allan Poe's stories really inspired the works of Jules Verne, who a lot of people consider one of the fathers of science fiction. In fact, Jules Verne loved Edgar Allan Poe's story so much, he wrote his own sequel to it, called The Ice Sphinx, or The Antarctic Mystery. In fact, Jules Verne, that story would then inspire H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft loved the previous works that came before. He essentially finished the fan fiction that Jules Verne wrote of Edgar Allan Poe with his own story, At the Mountains of Madness, down to the fact that Jules Verne's story ended with the expedition group not able to make it to the South Pole because their compasses were going crazy because of an iron mountain range. You could easily see how H.P. Lovecraft turned Verne's Iron Mountains into the Mountains of Madness. And of course, Alan Moore would continue and do his own take. In fact, Lovecraft inspired many modern writers. Alan Moore would do his own continuation of this with Nemo Heart of Ice in his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen series. So, and you could see that each of these individuals is really considered the father of their own branch of literature. And essentially, their big story that got them started were all essentially a fan fiction of a previous author that came before. And as Alan Moore liked to explain this, he calls this the literary game. And he says that what he's doing with his stories, like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, isn't really fan fiction. He's partaking in a literary game that all these authors have been playing. So to quote Alan Moore, he says, Jules Verne thinks Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is great, so he writes a sequel to it. H.P. Lovecraft likes the same story, so he writes a conclusion to it with At the Mountains of Madness. I don't think these people would have minded because these were good writers bringing something new to the mix. They weren't exploiting the works of the original. Jules Verne called his story The Ice Sphinx. He did not call it The Return of Arthur Gordon Pym. So that's the important thing. They weren't exploiting the work of the author that came before. They weren't trying to bank on the name of the author that came before. They were inspired by it and wanted to create their own new continuation of that story, adding new substances and new touches to it. So this leads us to what we really, the kind of the modern fandoms. So back before the Victorian era, most plays and most stories were really reserved for the upper class. Aside from Shakespeare's plays that he tried to put on for the lower classes, most operas and plays were written for aristocrats in mind because they were the only ones who could afford it. Most books that had to be handwritten could only be afforded by the kings and leaders. So these were the only people who had access to it. Now, with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, printing presses became cheaper. Printing became cheaper, and we started to see a new audience emerge, the middle class. Alan Moore would like to say that Jane Austen kind of helped inspire this range of middle class readers because she would be one of the first English writers to write specifically for the middle class. And of course, this was around the time the Sherlock Holmes stories were being written, and we kind of saw a new emergence of modernized fandoms because with new technology meant cheaper printing. So these fans could communicate with fanzines and mailing lists. So what we do nowadays as fandoms, how we, communicate with people on forums, boards, and Twitter, essentially these old fans were communicated through mailing lists and fanzines. So and I think I see we have some questions in the chat and I'll get to them later. And someone says the talk being recorded. I believe it is being recorded. I'm trying to record it from my own end. But yes, hopefully it's recorded. All right, so let's continue. As printing became cheaper, you started seeing a rise of people making their own fan fiction and fanzines. So one of the earliest examples of this is what we like to call the Tijuana Bible. Tijuana Bibles are short, little 8 to 10 page comics that took popular actors or characters around this time. So you would see Flash Gordon, Little Orphan Annie, Popeye, Humphrey Bogart. People would make short, little 8 to 10 page comics of these popular characters, and 90% of the time it was adult smut. So a lot of people think the modern realm of fan fiction that involves romance and smut and shipping is a modern concept. No, it's always been around. So like we see Tijuana Bibles as some of the first early fan comics, and 90% of them were adult smut. Now, as what we call media fandoms start exploding. In fact, I covered this in my con history panel, and I believe it's up on my YouTube channel if you want to check that out. But as media fandoms like Star Wars fandom, Star Trek fandom, and Doctor Who fandom started becoming more and more popular, we started to see more fanzines. Specifically within the Star Trek community, Trekkies would be the first to really write what we now know as slash fiction, which came from Kirk/Spock shipping. And of course, the term shipping from relationship also came around this time. So this is the concept where we take two characters that are normally not romantically related in in the canon show or property and actually make them romantically involved in your own fan comic. And Japan has really continued the tradition today with Doujinshi culture, which also emerged around the same time in the 70s and is actually really, really big, still going strong today. In fact, the Doujinshi culture, you could say, is responsible for the birth of the anime convention, with Comic-Con being the largest convention in the world. Comic-Con, held twice a year, 3 times bigger than San Diego Comic-Con, is essentially one giant artist alley that does nothing but sell fan comics. And like with the Tijuana Bibles that came before, a lot of these doujinshi were adult smut shipping fiction. All right. So what happened? Why is it that beforehand you could have H.P. Lovecraft and Jules Verne's and all these fanzine writers riff on stories that came before? Well, in America specifically, we have unique copyright laws, which is meant to protect the original creator from someone else exploiting their work. And this has carried over to our stories, our published fiction. Now, it really didn't become such a big issue, especially during this time when Mad Magazine and Cracked Magazine were doing a lot of parodies and satire of superheroes and media franchises. It really took Disney to be the ones who are partly responsible for cracking down on this. Now, the big work that a lot of people like identifying with this is a work called The Air Pirates. It was a fan comic that was meant to satirize Mickey Mouse and Walt Disney. Specifically, had Mickey and Minnie doing drugs and engaging in lewd acts. And for them, this was a political take on what they saw as Disney's. Disney represents mass cultural media. Disney represent capitalism, and it was their take to do their own, basically their own message. They believe themselves to be our artists are always dealing with political messages. So this was their attempt to kind of do a take back to Disney. Now, Disney eventually brought them to court to sue them, said their argument was the fact that that the Air Pirates comics look so similar to the Disney official comics that any random person on the street might accidentally pick up the comic, then see Mickey and Minnie, having lewd acts and snorting cocaine together, and mistake it as a Disney comic, and the parents are going to get angry and blame Disney. So, because of Disney's argument, they won the court case. And later on, Disney would help back what is now known as the Copyright Term Extension Act, which people have nicknamed the Mickey Mouse Copyright Protection Act because of how much Disney was involved with getting this passed. And it was really after, I would say, this period, this is when a lot of people started cracking down on fan fiction. So you could see throughout history, every time one of these franchises was about to go into the public domain, a lot of companies like Disney would try to fight back and prevent it by lobbying Congress to extend copyright law. So one of the arguments for this was it's to protect the creators. And you could say that's fair. As an artist myself, I don't want my work exploited. At the same time, it really protects the companies, because if you think about the creators of these works, like Siegel and Schuster, the creators of Superman, Jack Kirby, who created half the Marvel Universe, and Steve Ditko, who created Spider-Man and the other half of the Marvel Universe. These people ended up dying penniless. They never saw any real royalties or payment for essentially creating the largest franchises that are dominating the box offices today. So if we're trying to say that these copyright laws are meant to protect the creators, in reality, it does not. It protect the companies that own these franchises. Now, this is where the factor of fair use comes in. If you guys watch YouTube videos, you might know how you might hear fair use popped up now and again. While I would say fair use does not necessarily mean a work is transformative. I do think a lot of definitions are close. So I do like to bring up fair use as we look at examples of fan fictions that were allowed to be published. So when we look at fair use, one of the things that comes up is what's the purpose and use of the copyright material. Is it going to be commercial? Is it going to be a non-profit? The other part is the nature of the copyrighted work. How much of it is in public domain? The third example is how much of the work is used in relationship to the whole. So if you upload an entire episode of BoJack Horseman, for example, onto YouTube and have a small reaction of yourself at the bottom screen, that probably wouldn't consider it because you're uploading a whole episode and trying to say you have commentary on top of it. That would not work. And the fourth is how much will it affect the potential market of that? And because of a lot of these rules and restrictions, you start to see after this period, most fan fiction writers and fanzine writers were really afraid to show the works in public. In fact, before then, there was a really nice, healthy relationship between Star Trek fans, for example, and them sharing their fan fiction with Gene Roddenberry, who would say, "Oh yeah, I make sure to have my staff read your fan fiction." And for a period, even George Lucas was okay with people doing fan fiction of Star Wars. And I think as someone mentioned in the chat, essentially George Lucas's works are his own fan fictions of earlier science fiction golden age works like Flash Gordon. Now, I know there's a lot of people who talk about a lot of people who do academic studies of fan fiction. So I'm sure they have their own different theories and interpretation, but based on my history research for my convention history book, my conclusion is I saw, because a lot of people were afraid to legally put their fan fiction out in public, there was no longer a need to have a transformative message, a big subversive message, like with the air pirates and other fan fiction that came before. So if you're only going to have your fan fiction read by a small circle of fans, you're going to start seeing fan fiction becoming more and more insular, more and more personal. It's going to appeal to a smaller niche group of people. And as such, from this period, we start seeing more self-insert OCs being inserted into their stories. This is when we have the term Mary Sue being used for a self-insert who's kind of perfect in every way. And as we see, as the internet kind of came about, we start seeing fan fiction websites come out, so anyone could upload their fan fiction. So we started to see a period where fan fiction went from being subversive and transformative to being more derivative, sense self-insert ego fests, for the lack of term. Some fan fictions were able to later legally be published when they filed off the serial numbers. Like, for example, the 50 Shades of Grey was actually a Twilight fan fiction with the names changed. But you could see that these types of works were very, very insular and were derivative. So one of the examples we could use for explaining when a fan fiction or could be legally defined, we could actually look at one of the music lawsuits that came about to the Supreme Court, which ruled that elements can be riffed from copyrighted works to create a new work in the terms of the Supreme Court Justice, as he says, if the works use comment on the original author you're riffing on's work. So, for example, he said, if on the contrary, the commentary has no critical bearing on the substance or style of the original composition, other factors loom, like the extent of its commercial ability. So let's use this as examples to look at works that actually ended up going into court cases and seeing which ones were allowed to be published. So we have... Okay, it looks like I have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try to hurry up as fast as I can. So there was a Catcher in the Rye fan fiction. It was a unauthorized sequel. It tried to call itself a parody. The problem is this was not allowed to be published because it was trying to bank off the markability of Catcher in the Rye and J.D. Salinger. It added nothing of substance to J.D. Salinger's original work. On the other hand, you might say, okay, well, if it's educational, it should be okay, right? So the Harry Potter lexicon is one example of this. But the problem is the fact that the Harry Potter lexicon used a lot of J.K. Rowling's original writings for their guidebook, and it would also affect the market in case J.K. Rowling wanted to do her own encyclopedia of Harry Potter. This was not allowed to be published. So let's look at the example of parody. So you might think, okay, The Cat Not in the Hat, a retelling of the O.J. Simpson murders in the style of Cat in the Hat should be allowed to be published. Well, the problem is, yes, it was a parody. The problem is it used Dr. Seuss's writing style and art style without providing any commentary or criticism on Dr. Seuss himself. So if you're trying to use a author's unique distinctive style, you have to have a commentary for the most part on that author to make it seen as transformative. In the case of Cat Not in the Hat, it basically just used Dr. Seuss's style because it would probably attract more people in the market. Another example is The Last Ring Bearer. You might think this might be okay. It was not allowed to be published in English, even though it's uploaded online. It's a reinterpretation of Lord of the Rings, with Mordor seen as a good, peaceful country on the verge of industrialization, while the imperialist factions of the wizards and elves tried to crush them. Some countries allowed this to be published and some haven't. And then we have the example I like to use, The Wind Done Gone. This was allowed to be published because, first of all, it tried to avoid using the names of the original characters in the Gone with the Wind. And second, it added a new layer of social commentary for the work. So while Gone with the Wind was a book written for white aristocrats, the white middle class, Wind Done Gone was a story told from the perspective of the black female slave. Black female slave seen as one of the lowest, was seen as lowest on the social class back during the Civil War period, changes the entire dynamic of the Gone with the Wind story. So by doing this, it basically changes the social commentary and thus was considered transformative and thus allowed to be published. So when we look at the cases of books that were allowed, fan fictions that were allowed to be published, the only ones that could be published were the ones that were transformative. They were not trying to bank off the original name, the original work it was copying. It wasn't trying to make its own fan fiction with the characters. It was trying to add new substance and new commentary. So I would argue, by that standard, almost every franchise reboot and retcon that we see nowadays would technically not fall under this transformative clause. Of course, because these companies own the rights to these franchises, they're allowed to publish them. But I would argue they don't have the transformative qualities that we would look at. And this is because most books and works that kind of change the substance of the original piece that we're used to might not be marketable. So, for example, we could look at the two new Star Wars movies. The Force Awakens essentially just copied A New Hope. It was a safe story that repeated the same beats that you would need to know. And a lot of people liked it. As you can see, both the audience and the critic score were very, very high for Force Awakens. However, Last Jedi, whether you like it or not, you could argue was very, very subversive. It took what you knew about Star Wars and really, really amped it up and changed the things. And because it changed how the public viewed Star Wars so much, a lot of people didn't like it. And as you can see, the audience score for it is really, really low. So most companies want to try to play it safe, which is why you see them hash out safe stories as opposed to more experimental, transformative stories. You see this now a lot of days, especially with 80s nostalgia, 80s and 90s nostalgia. You see a lot of movies, books, and TV shows essentially trying to bank off nostalgia and marketability. Even with My Little Pony, which I would say was Lauren Faust's My Little Pony was a transformative take on the franchise that came before. Once Lauren Faust's My Little Pony became very, very popular, Hasbro really wanted to exploit the hell out of it and, made stuff like Equestria Girls and stuff. So Alan Moore doesn't like this. He calls this. He would explain this as like photocopying of a photocopy. For me, as the genetic biologist, I like to see this as basically inbreeding. So you could see that, yeah. So it's basically inbreeding. It's incestuous. These stories are retelling over and over again. Alan Moore and his protege Grant Neil Gaiman would argue that most superhero comics we see now were written by fanboys of Silver Age superhero comics, and thus would retell these same stories they like over and over and over again, essentially photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy. Or if you saw BoJack Horseman, a Xerox of a Xerox. So this is why I would say, and also Alan Moore would say, he's not a hypocrite when he is doing his own takes on these franchise characters, because he is adding new substance to it. And in fact, when people were criticizing Alan Moore for doing his own take on Harry Potter, one could argue that Harry Potter itself is a derivative of previous works. For example, Harry Potter was not the first British boarding school for witches. That was Worst Witch. Harry Potter also isn't the first a chosen one who had to defeat the Dark Lord. That's the Dark is Rising. Harry Potter wasn't the first to have a magical platform under King's Cross to go to a magical world. That was the secret of Platform 13. And even the look of Harry Potter, you could say, came from Alan Moore's protege Neil Gaiman's Book of Magic series. In fact, the term muggles came from an author who also wrote a book about Larry Potter. So even Harry Potter itself, if you even look away from all the stuff that J.K. Rowling used, like unicorns and stuff drawn from British mythology, is really, really steeped in this idea of magical wizard chosen ones in boarding schools. In fact, the name Harry Potter was first used by Alan Moore in his Lost Girls series as the husband of Wendy from Peter Pan. So you can see why Alan Moore is very, very upset with people trying to do this on of his characters. And even the Watchmen HBO series, which won a lot of awards and people would say is very, very transformative and good, the fact that it's named Watchmen, that it's not called like Watchmen 2 or something else, the fact that it's named Watchmen, no matter how good and transformative it is, it's aping off Watchmen's pre-existing IP and identity to market itself. Alan Moore's Watchmen is a very, very complex work. And even though he is basically writing his own fan fiction of the Charlton characters, there's a lot of nuance and detail to his work that he is putting into his own work. For example, most people don't realize how the eye, the blood splatter on the smiley face, is a motif repeated throughout Watchmen, and how basically the first panel and last panel of every single issue is essentially a repeating of the cover image. If we look at Doomsday Clock, which is marketed itself as the official sequel to Watchmen, you could see that the Doomsday Clock covers have nothing to do with the last panel as Watchmen did. In fact, the covers that are marketed the most are the ones that are going to sell the most and attract most buyers, like the one with Superman with Dr. Manhattan on the cover. On the other hand, Grant Morrison, who actually keep on saying he really, really hates Watchmen and he really, really hates Alan Moore's, dislikes Alan Moore's work on Watchmen. His fan fiction of Watchmen, Pax Americana, you could argue, is much more transformative because he understands the nuances of what Alan Moore was trying to do with Watchmen. So this is why I like to put Pax Americana on one end of the transformative scale and Doomsday Clock on the other end of the scale. And I think that wraps it up for my presentation portion of the panel, because I think I am running a little late. So if you guys have any questions or anything you want to bring up, feel free to put it into the question chat, and I'll take questions as long as they until they kick me off. With that, thank you very much for coming to my Transformative versus Derivative panel here at PonyFest Online 4. Reminder, I am a vendor at PonyFest Online. You could check out my con store in the Discord chat. You can also check out my store. I have a custom store at conhistory.com/PonyFest. You can also follow me on Twitter and YouTube at Transformative, and I'll be uploading video essays similar to this, hopefully in the near future. So with that, thank you guys very much, and let me try to take some questions. Let me see. Okay, so someone in the question chat brought out Fall Equestria. And this is one that I used to bring up all the time, Fall Equestria. The problem is I have not read Fall Equestria, so I can't comment on it. But this was the answer I normally give to panels at my panels in person. So if you could take Fall Equestria, give it to someone who has no knowledge of Fallout or My Little Pony, and they are able to get some type of strong, enjoyable story with substance behind it, I would argue Fall Equestria is transformative. If you need to rely on My Little Pony and Fallout to make the story impactful, then I would say it's not as transformative. So I guess depending on how you guys see Fallout, that's one answer. And I guess Midnight's panels were after me, so I want to say, I want to give a shout out to Midnight. Okay, let me see what's the other definite, what other questions I have. Oh yeah, so Fiora, I actually I was going to do this panel. I was going to do a panel with her at one of the cons before COVID canceled all these events. The fact that she is able to publish her fan fiction from one legal route, and I'm trying to publish my fan stories from another legal route. I'm trying to use a transformative clause, and she's trying to use the legal clause. I think is interesting that has the two ways of how we both like to approach these different storytellings. All right, and I think that is it. Okay, I have a 3-minute warning, so if you guys have any more questions, feel free to add them, and I'm going to try to read through the questions now. Okay, so Midnight, you ask, you say creators are the ones who misinterpret the ones that came before, but can it be said that they're also the ones who deliberately rebel against convention? Yes, yes. So if we look at the history of most genres, so if we think about like going back to Michael Moorcock's New Wave science fiction, it was a deliberate rebellion to Golden Age science fiction. Um, Postmodernism was, of course, a rebellion against modernism. Ex- Actually, a perfect example is H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft hated modernism so much, in fact, that he wrote a brilliant parody of Eliot's Wasteland called Waste Paper, which a lot of people would argue is actually a brilliant modernist story in of itself. In fact, the fact that H.P. Lovecraft hated modernism and tried to rebel against it, a lot of people would say he's actually one of the best modernist writers because his stories encompass a lot of modernist tropes. Of course, H.P. Lovecraft and Cthulhu mythos gave way to a postmodern era as well, which included Alan Moore and all the others. All right, and I think that's it for my panel. Thank you guys very, very much. Up next, Midnight Premiere is doing her panel, so feel free to check it out. If you guys have any more questions for me, feel free to message me on Discord or on Twitter. I am doing the Convention Nightmares panel later tonight, so feel free to check that out. Thank you very much.